Metamorphics podcast. I'm joined today by Dean Abbott. Dean is a certified pastoral counselor and coach, communication expert, theologian, and author. He's authored 2 books, The Common Good, Reflections on Everyday Life, Everyday Vices and Virtues, and on Character and Community. And I'll have Dean's website, Linktree, in the bio. Dean, hello.
Hey, hello, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Doing well. Yeah, honored to have you here.
Well,
So I
thank you
just
very
wanted to, I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the work you do, pastoral counseling, coaching,
much.
um, and maybe just starting out with a little bit about your background, just what's relevant to, what brought you to your work, and maybe
Mhm.
just a little bit about your work too.
So it's interesting. It's been a kind of a road. I have been a teacher for many years, and I got on Twitter and really been actively on Twitter for about a decade. And I've probably been coaching and counseling for 4 years, maybe 5. But what happened is I just started writing on Twitter, and I got so many people writing to me and asking for advice and help that I essentially just created a way for people who really want my help to talk to me face to face, and for me to have some remuneration for that. And that sort of grew into an ongoing practice. During that time, I got certified as a pastoral counselor, all of that. But I really started out just talking to people as a coach from my Twitter feed because of the things I was tweeting and the things that I was interested in, which are essentially the same things I'm interested in today, though my depth of understanding is significantly greater than it was a decade ago when I started.
Hmm. Yeah, could you tell me a little bit about what pastoral counseling is?
Well, it's like everything in these fields, it's a little bit amorphous in terms of its boundaries. I think most technically pastoral counseling is associated with a church. And so now I don't necessarily work out of a church. I do contract work with churches from time to time where I meet with parishioners and that kind of thing. Um, but essentially it's a practice of working with people to help them grow with typically within the context of sort of Christian belief and institution. And it's an interesting thing to do because I have had clients who are Muslim. I've had Jewish clients. I have
Mhm.
had a Hindu clients. I've had, clients who are thoroughgoingly secular in many ways, all of whom come to me. I think what matters most is the relationship between us
Mm.
and their sense of my flexibility and ability to help them. And so while I am certified as a pastoral counselor and I do work with churches and in some way I'm always within the Christian tradition. I'm always within a
Mm.
Christian context, but uh, because of the kinds of things that people come to me with, unless they come to me with specific theological concerns, which sometimes they do,
Mm.
there are many problems that I found that I can help people with, and many many growth processes that I find I'm kind of able to encourage and walk people through regardless of their sort of faith commitment or lack thereof.
Mm. Mm. That's interesting. It's interesting that you get people from different faith backgrounds
Yeah,
in maybe more of a, yeah.
I think it's because of the way I kind of present myself that while I am always working within the Christian tradition, sort of metaphysically, in terms of my
Mm-hmm.
most basic metaphysical and ethical
Mm-hmm.
assumptions, that there are those kinds of basic assumptions don't necessarily come up very much when you're just trying to tell a guy how he should talk to his wife. That that maybe telling her that she's wrong about how she feels is a less productive strategy than actually taking a moment to listen.
Mm, I see. And I think that maybe that's pointing to what you were saying with the relationship component being
Mhm.
almost primary in that kind of dyad is not so much the theology, which maybe it does come up, but it's actually the kind of human relationship that you see as the biggest factor.
Yeah. Oh, certainly the relationship between me and the client is the biggest factor,
Yeah.
and then also I'm not a therapist, and I talk about myself as a pastoral counselor, coach, and communication expert. My doctoral degree is in communication rather than in psychology.
Hmm.
And many people, I would say the majority of people who come to me because they're struggling with a relational issue and they're trying to figure that out. So the relationship between me and the client is paramount. And then there are also other relationships that the client is experiencing and working to try to figure out how to improve. And that tends to be like the bulk of a lot of our work.
Mm, I see. Also really interested in the metaphysical assumptions that you have in this Christian context.
Mhm.
And I know a little bit about Christianity, but I also maybe want to see if I could hear a little bit about what those assumptions are and
Mhm.
if they're possible to articulate.
Well, I think the most basic Christian assumption is that Jesus Christ is the ruler of all reality, right? That if it is real, it is subject to Christ. That's part of what makes us Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the basic one. I think the most important one is probably that Christianity, I think, provides something that is missing in a lot of what we might think of as secular therapies, in
Mm-hmm.
that it provides an end for the human being. It provides us a model of what the flourishing human being looks like. And I think one of the real drawbacks of a lot of therapeutic enterprises is that there's no clearly defined sense of what the flourishing person is. And so we don't really have like a model toward which we ought to be aiming. And I and the question of what is the purpose of the human being is a fundamentally religious question. And I know that it is that there are many people who are therapists, many people who are interested in these topics who don't want to necessarily acknowledge that, but it is
Mm-hmm.
true that if you're dealing with human beings long enough and you're dealing with them deeply enough, you always kind of impinge on religious questions. You might,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the benefit of being a pastoral counselor and having that be foregrounded for me is
Mm-hmm.
that clients come to me knowing that I can go beyond that line with them. And we can actually bring into our work together really profound questions that are by their very nature religious. And I think just being upfront about that is actually quite a help to the people who come to me. And so I think having a religious tradition that provides for me as a counselor and coach guide a picture of where I'm supposed to try to help take these people is absolutely critical. And that's probably the central assumption that
Mm,
affects the way I interact with people, is the sense that
mm.
there is a goal, there is a way that as human beings we can find a flourishing, and we're not clueless about what that is.
Yeah. Oh, I love what you're saying. It's so true. I mean, you can't. I think it's an unavoidable aspect of therapy, of the endeavor to help people change. And the question is, will change into what? And and I think there's a lot of ways you can go about responding to that question. And one is to say, well, we're not, like, as a therapist, as a secular therapist, we're not concerned with ontology or epistemology or theology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to make that move, you have to deny a fundamental component of being human. And so you can really handcuff yourself if you make that
Yeah.
move. And I think many therapists do, and they can be lovely therapists, but then maybe there's an aspect of their work that hasn't really been critically examined.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what I'm hearing from you is it's really refreshing actually just to be really upfront about, like, here's what I actually believe is is the sort of telos, is the sort of the end goal of being human. And I'm
Yes,
wondering if you could, yeah.
I just say it's interesting too, now that you say all of that, right? Like, as a person who's self-consciously religious, and as a person who works as a counselor, and in a way that foregrounds that, it becomes incumbent upon me to kind of lead with that, right? I put that in my Twitter bio. People know who I am, whatever.
Mhm.
And the sort of more secular therapist, the kind you're talking about, who's sort of handcuffed when it comes to these questions, no one ever asks those people to lead with their basic ontological, metaphysical, ethical assumptions. Like, you never have
Mm.
to go, only the sort of the more religiously inclined counselor has to do that. And it might be a good thing for clients if you went
Mm.
to a more secular therapist who said, either I'm a materialist and I believe there's, there
Yeah.
is no end for the human being, or just a person said, I've never thought about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, but for some reason, we don't expect sort of more mainstream or secular therapists to have to disclose
Uh-huh.
their underlying assumptions in the way that more overtly religious counselors or whatever do.
Yeah. Yeah, because you can't avoid
Although,
it.
right. Although expecting them to expecting those kinds of therapists to to disclose those basic assumptions might be in the best interest of the client.
I totally agree. I'm so glad we're on this topic because it's, to me, one of the most it's talked about in psychotherapy, but it really, the depth and breadth of this topic, which is essentially how does one's basic, like, I think what you were saying there, like ontological ethical assumptions impact their work. And of course it does, because wherever we go, we're putting on a certain way of seeing and way of being in the world that has certain assumptions that are ontological, that, we have this assumption that some people might have an assumption that there is a basic goodness to everybody.
Mhm.
And and that's just a fact, and there's nothing that can shake that. That's just like, it's a core to my understanding of life and myself
Mhm.
and others is just more so nihilistic, is that everything's, in a sense, everything's sexual, and everything's kind of, there's kind of
Mhm.
a beast inside of all of us, and there's ways in which the societal rules and regulations inhibit our bestial natures to make us a little bit more polite, or,
Right.
yeah. And so what can we expect? And for some people, what we can expect is, you can essentially, you can more skillfully and appropriately use your instincts. You don't have to just be this horny, hungry, angry beast. You can kind of use that creatively, but ultimately that doesn't change the status of your
Mhm.
of your nature.
It doesn't
Um,
make you not a beast.
exactly. And so what I'm hearing more, and that's not true for all therapists. So a lot, like
Sure.
I think more of the humanities, like humanitarian, kind of like what I'm thinking of, Carl Rogers,
Humanistic, right? Humanistic
humanistic.
tradition.
Thank you. Um, would believe in more of a developmental pathway that is more of it into a sort of basic goodness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's changing too in modern day psychotherapy, but maybe early school psychoanalysis, um, a little bit more pessimistic.
Sure.
So yeah, what would be your leading assumption that you have? And you talked a little bit about it, but of how you view the person, and how would Christianity view the person, and what can we expect to be the end goal of the human
Right.
person?
Well, it's very interesting. As you know, as I'm sure you know, there are differences in answering this question among Christians. And so I think what ultimately comes down to is the question, well, all theological anthropologies revolve around the question of sin, all Christian theological anthropologies. Okay. So you ultimately have to sort of think a lot about what sin is. And there are in fact Christian people who counsel who have a very strict understanding of what sin is, in the sense that they ultimately sort of just think it's breaking God's rules. I My understanding of sin is, I think, more complex than that, and that I would simply say that what it means to be a sinner is to be a human being whose nature is uh, incomplete, because our nature finds its fulfillment in the being of God, and yet there are things about us that separate us from from finding that fulfillment in God's being,
Hmm.
and that the role of any kind of, I would think, pastor, shepherd, uh, counselor, guide, spiritual director, is to help the person move in a really honest way through the many things, the many obstacles, or as the hymn says, the many toils and snares that
Hmm.
separate you from your fulfillment in God.
Hmm.
And so this this is actually really important in this line of work, because I am not a person who would ever begin from a point of moral failure.
Hmm.
So I do think there are moral failures, right?
Hmm.
Guy comes to me and he's, I don't know, I yelled at my wife and I called her a bunch of bad names. That's a real
Hmm.
moral failure. Okay. But I do not have an understanding of sin that would lend itself to thinking the right response to that is to say, you need to figure out what makes you need to stop being so bad, which is the kind of more simplistic approach that unfortunately does find itself, or unfortunately, I think, if you I think most people go to your standard,
Hmm.
what's often called biblical counseling,
Hmm.
you would get that approach, more of seeing more of that sort of behavioral level focus. how can we get you to stop committing these sins, which we define as moral failure?
Mm-hmm.
Or and and so I just tend to think that approach tends to be very surface oriented and tends to be counterproductive insofar as it turns people on themselves in a way that causes them to see themselves as further objects of scorn, or it
Uh-huh.
intensifies their shame rather than sort of saying, well, you have to understand that when you get angry and you call your wife a name,
Mm-hmm.
you are being something less than what you're called to be, and that there's a sort of glory in being human that we want to walk you toward. And
Mm-hmm.
so that you don't, I would never start with this guy with a sort of shame oriented approach. It's very important to me. And where I say, well, look at how terrible you are.
Right.
Now if he's a guy who's like putting his wife in danger, that's different. We'd have to take that a different approach. But the fundamental assumption is that you are coming to me because you need some help moving from, as the Bible says, glory to glory. So you are in this position as a human being, and that to be a human being is itself a glorious and important thing. But but we want to take the next step forward toward this final glorification, which comes as you find your fulfillment ultimately in the being of God.
Mm. Oh, beautiful. It certainly rings true that when one is trying to change a habit or behavior that's destructive or harmful, shame is not the best medicine, and actually
Mhm.
usually quite counterproductive to actually helping us change. Usually actually reinforces the behavior.
The real Christian assumption about the world is that it is good, and um, that all things which have been made are good. But now some of them are corrupted, some of them are misused,
Mhm.
whatever. It's like the guy calling his wife a name. Like, language is good, but it's misused. And I do think there are Christians who counsel who really don't have not integrated fully enough into their own belief systems the central fundamental Christian assumption that all creation is good,
Mm.
and that I just think we have to begin with the assumption as any kind of, I don't even know what's the word, like, not counselor,
Mm.
spiritual director, even pastor, right? We have to begin with the fundamental Christian assumption: the person coming to us is good. It is a good thing to be that person.
Mm.
And there are just many people working in the church or in sort of Christian oriented counseling, I think, who don't have that full integrated well enough into their approach to working with people.
Mm. I like the way you're framing sin, and I would imagine a lot of people who haven't thought much about this, or maybe they were forced to be, forced to go to church or forced to
Uh,
be Catholic growing up, and there's the common phrase of Catholic guilt. Just you're doomed to be a sinner, and that's your nature, and you have to kind of punish yourself if you sin, and then just kind of getting stuck in those same cycles of guilt and punishment and doing it for
hmm,
God, but then and people getting stuck in that cycle and saying, okay, well, I'm leaving religion behind because that just made me suffer, traumatized me. But I think
hmm,
what you're saying is actually, it's like you're framing the way that you're seeing Christianity, and I largely agree, is that it's actually sees the world as good, sees
hmm.
people as good, and there's ways in which we are incomplete with God, or we are in some way turned away from God, and so that leads to behavior that is out of alignment with goodness.
Sure. Which the Christian term for that is sin.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
Out
I
of
love that
alignment.
definition.
Yes, but that's really important. Actually, what you said, I think, is actually really important to think of sin as choices that are out of alignment with goodness, right? When goodness is understood, when the good is understood as the final human spiritual destination, right? So that those choices are not just out of alignment with some abstract notion of what's right. They're out of
Mhm.
alignment with the final destination, the final spiritual destination of the human person. And
Mm.
so they are self-defeating insofar as they either move you further away from that end, or they just keep you stuck or whatever.
Mhm.
And I think that's really actually a very important way to think about the concept of sin versus thinking of it as one more negative mark against me.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I love what you're saying there, and for me, this actually helped me get a little more specific about something, and that's the idea of, you're out of alignment with X. And what is X? Is it an abstract notion of what's right? Like, oh, I should have done the dishes. A good person does the dishes. So I'm not a
Right.
good person. Is it that, or is it actually more of a acknowledgement of the way that I'm being in the world is out of alignment with a fundamental goodness that I know to be true. And
Right.
those are fundamentally different statements.
Mhm. Mhm. Not only is it a fundamental goodness that you know to be true, it is the destination for which you're aiming.
Yes, so that your behavior is actually self-sabotaging you
Mhm.
from
Yeah.
yeah.
Now, you should know, you may not be aware, what I am saying and the way that I'm praising these things would be wildly controversial in many Christian circles.
Really?
Oh, yes.
Why do you
And
think that is? Yeah.
well, to answer that question, I exhaustively would require someone who knows much more about me, about, say, the history of the Reformation than I
Mm-hmm.
do. But in certain Reformed circles, any sense that the human being is fundamentally has a kind of fundamental goodness that that the human being desires goodness. These are controversial statements because their understanding of sin is exactly what I'm saying. Like, the human being is wicked. And so I think this is a fundamental
Mm.
distinction. This may be helpful to people who are listening. That there is in the history of Christian thought a conflict. I don't know if I even want to say conflict, but there is a tension between people whose understanding of sin and theological anthropology is human beings are wicked, and their goodness comes from the way that the Spirit of God helps them to constrain their wickedness. Okay. Then there is another approach which says the human being is born desiring union with God, who in his being is the good, right? So the human being desires the good, and we have an inclination to get stuck on our journey in that direction.
Mm.
And many things can screw that journey up. And so that when we engage in some moral failure, it is a kind of self-sabotaging behavior that is at odds with our deepest nature. These,
Mm.
you see the conflict, right? One who says any good that you produce is produced because God has given you His
Yes.
Spirit to constrain your evil, and the other
Yes.
says, "Oh, the evil, the moral failures you find yourself in, are in fact um, an aberration from the sort of deeper goodness that you desire."
Yes. So on the one hand, the deepest nature is wickedness, and the other hand, the deepest nature is goodness.
Yes, I think I just want to be fair. I think that you also have to distinguish between a kind of more popular Christianity and sort of more serious, more thoughtful theology. So, like when you're mentioning the sort of Catholic guilt, I see that as a kind of popular Catholicism.
Yes.
But whereas if you went and you really spoke to theologians of the church, they might have a much more nuanced view. And what I'm laying out is kind of unnuanced, and so I don't want to be totally unfair to those people. But I do think that that does what I that the tension that I laid out there is real and does capture those. Though some people might quibble with it from what might want to nuance those views a little bit more.
You're pointing to something really important, though, because there is an assumption of our deepest nature here and ultimately our final destination as humans, which is an assumption that in a lot of ways, if you're working with somebody and your intention is to help them grow, change, transform in any fashion, there is an assumption of what good transformation is, or
Mm-hmm.
what in what, you know, or maybe it wouldn't be framed in this way, but what bad transformation is.
Mm-hmm.
And around that assumption has at its heart, what do you think a person is? Do you think a person is this bundle of instincts, like a beast that kind
Mm-hmm.
of needs to tame their desires and tame their instinctual drives, uh, so that they can function as a member of the world, from of the society with rules and regulations? Or are they fundamentally good, and in some ways that goodness gets obscured through various obstacles in life? And I think that would actually fundamentally change how you would approach a person.
I think so. How could it not? Right. And especially when it, I don't know, you follow me on Twitter, and you know I tend to write a lot on Twitter about sort of the effects of trauma and traumatizing experience on people. And given the perspective I've just laid out,
Mm.
you can see how experiencing trauma, whatever that is, I would sort of approach that immediately as that is the thing that sort of that sort of tends to screw up your
Mm.
spiritual progress toward the good, toward God. And so you to deal the way we deal with that is always in the context of how is this inhibiting your growth? How is this thing you had experienced at 7, 10, 12, whatever? Experience, how is that inhibiting your pathway toward God, toward the good
Mm.
now?
Mm.
And as opposed to having a kind of approach to counseling people that says, okay, so going back to the guy who yelled at his wife. Okay, so you yelled at your wife. How I think there are many people working within a Christian context who would think that the question for the, the counselor, spiritual director, whatever, is for the guy who yelled at his wife. The question is, how do I increase his self control so that he doesn't yell so much? Okay. I would want to say, okay, so you're yelling at your wife. What is that? That's a symbol. That is a sign for us that there is something in you that is stuck. Let's get down beneath that and see what we can clear out so that you can keep moving forward. And so for me, it's not so much about self-control. I mean, obviously, though, self-control is part of it, but it's deeper. It's not about how do I help this guy increase his self-control. It's about how do I help this guy clear out whatever is blocking him from being able to control himself.
Yes.
Do you see the distinction?
Yeah, I see and that movement you could only do that movement if you had that assumption that there is a fundamental goodness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really interesting that, especially with secular therapists who a lot of them I think are inclined to think that way, but metaphysically and consciously articulating that would be very difficult because you then make an ontological claim about the nature of reality that you have no backing for. You have no theological or ontological backing to really say that.
It's interesting. Like therapists, like so many people in the West, continue to unconsciously function from the vestigial Christian frame that was part of the West. And they do have essentially Christian assumptions to a certain degree. But like you said, they are unaware of it. They couldn't articulate it. They don't know where it comes from. They don't know how they got it. It's just always been there. It's in the book. And they themselves have not necessarily been curious enough about why they think that.
Right. Yeah, and I think it might come down to, well, people are suffering, and how do we help people suffer less? Or maybe that might be kind of where a lot of people land. But it's a very, very important topic. It's something I think about probably too much. It's just how to. I think in my own practice, I also have an assumption of a basic goodness. And I wouldn't presuppose beforehand what that looks like for any particular person. I think everyone's got a unique expression of that. But again, I wouldn't consider myself Christian. And so there is kind of a lack of it's kind of a lack of ground for me to even make that claim. And I find it's sometimes interesting reflecting on my own assumptions when I'm doing therapy. It's like, oh yeah, I'm talking to this person as if this were true. This is kind of a metaphysical claim I'm making. Yeah, but there's not a lot of space to reflect on that, I think, as a therapist, because there isn't really in the history of psychotherapy, we kind of point back to Freud, and he's an atheist. So there really isn't a lot of open discussion of the ways in which theology actually underpins psychotherapy.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. A person who's influenced me a lot is Viktor Frankl, who many people know from Man's Search for Meaning. But if you look a little deeper into Frankl, he brings up exactly these issues because I don't know how much you know about him or about existential psychoanalysis and that kind of thing, but the question of meaning is paramount for him. And he makes very clear that meaning is discovered rather than invented. So he's not a kind of Sartrean existentialist who thinks meaning is only whatever you make. He thinks there's a meaning out there. And he tries to kind of avoid being overtly religious about it, about his understanding of psychotherapy, but in implication, it's impossible because he wants to turn all of his clients fundamentally this question of meaning. And I think that part of the reason part of what he brings to discussion that's very helpful is the beginning of some way to begin talking about the religious undercurrent that plays out in so much psychotherapeutic effort,
Mm.
and to begin sort of integrating that into the history of psychotherapy in a way, kind of what you're bringing up. I think Jung also is a lot about
Yeah.
trying to make some space for something other than hardcore materialism. I think from the
Hmm.
very beginning, those guys are. This question was obviously on people's minds from the very beginning, and Frankl has one answer, Jung has another answer, but they're both addressing the question in that way.
Yeah, yeah. And it kind of what brought it up for me is in a lot of therapy situations and therapeutic encounters, and I wonder if this is the same with coaching as well, but people are coming in for a reason. They're coming in, usually there's something that happened in their life, getting in these arguments, or I'm having these anger issues. There's some object in their attention that they're seeing as the problem. Rarely is it the actual problem. And I think
Right.
that's kind of everyone like rarely is that the actual thing. And so in a way, the therapist is some therapists will work in a way where they view that problem behavior as the problem and then work on skill development to
Mhm.
have that problem go away. And if that's your way of working, then I don't entirely know if you need to humor these kinds of questions to do that work effectively.
Right.
It will definitely affect how you are in relationship with another person. But I
Mhm.
don't. Yeah, if you're just trying to help someone fix a um,
Skills deficit.
skills deficit, yeah, something like that. Yeah, but if you're interested in personality change, in character change, in changing not just one's habits, but one's whole way of being, that's a fundamentally religious question. Because
Yes, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that I work with people at all those levels, right? So I do work with people who just come to me. Not every person is open or capable at every point in life of diving deep enough to go through that total personality transformation.
Mhm.
And so I think the benefit or the advantage of kind of the approach that I take is that I can work with people from the sort of most shallow skills deficit training
Mhm.
and down to the core of these sort of fundamental religious heartfelt questions. And
Mhm.
I'm able to work up and down that scale based on what the client needs and wants at any given time. And it and I do have people at any given time who come to me for at all kinds of points up and down that scale. And so there's a lot of my kind of initial work is assessing where does that person want to work, where does that person need to work, and
Mhm.
sort of working with the client to determine all that.
Hmm. I like that. That's cool. You can hit all those different levels, and it's interesting how it's all kind of embedded within your way of working and understanding the person as their final destination being goodness and completeness with God.
Yeah, so that's actually a good point that I didn't think of. That from my point of view, right? If I'm just helping a guy figure out a way to communicate with his wife in a way that causes fewer arguments, even then, I'm helping him remove whatever obstacles
Yeah, yeah,
are
yeah.
prevent, and so all the way up and down that scale, from
Hmm.
skills deficit to deep heart transformation. From my end, I'm doing the same thing.
Yeah, you are. And whereas someone else could be, well, because the reason I do my job is because it makes people more functional
Mhm.
in the world, a valued member in society. Um, Maybe they suffer less. But yeah, they're not so clear. The embedded value or onto ethical system that they're just existing within and working within is not so well defined.
Right. I think that's an advantage. I think that's a strength, actually.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Well, I feel like this might be a good place to end.
Yeah, we've been going an hour or so.
Yeah, this was a lovely conversation. I didn't
thank you very much.
expect it. Yeah, I didn't expect it to go this direction, but I'm really glad it did. It's kind of been my area of fixation right now is just around the onto-ethical framework or ways of seeing how that affects our practice.
Right. Okay, well, yeah, let's do it again sometime.
Love to. Thanks, Dean.
Thank you.